My name is Elena, and I am 28 years old. I never thought I would stand up at my brother's wedding reception and deliver a speech that would tear our family apart forever. But sometimes the truth has to be told, no matter how much it hurts. Let me tell you about the moment I finally said what needed to be said after years of watching my parents choose my golden child brother over me, even when I was fighting cancer alone. Before I begin, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt like the forgotten child in your own family. I grew up in an affluent suburb of Chicago in a beautiful colonial house that screamed success from every perfectly manicured corner. My parents, Robert and Catherine Martinez, were both successful professionals. Dad was a corporate lawyer and Mom was a real estate broker. They had worked hard to build what looked like the perfect American dream: 2 children, a stunning home, luxury cars, and enough money to give us every opportunity. My brother Marcus came first, and from the moment I arrived 2 years later, it was clear that he was the sun around which our family's universe revolved. Even as a toddler, I understood that Marcus was special in ways I could never be. When I was 5 and Marcus was 7, we both started taking piano lessons. I showed natural talent, picking up melodies by ear and playing with an intuitive grace. That impressed our teacher, Mrs. Chen. Marcus struggled with rhythm and reading music, often frustrated to tears during practice sessions. But when recital time came, our parents' enthusiasm was reserved entirely for Marcus's halting performance of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, while my flawless rendition of a Bach invention earned only polite applause and a quick, "Good job, sweetie," before they turned back to praising Marcus for his improvement. This pattern became the backdrop of our childhood. When Marcus joined Little League, Dad became an assistant coach and never missed a game, even though Marcus spent most of his time on the bench. When I joined the debate team and made it to state championships, Mom said she was proud but couldn't attend because Marcus had a minor ear infection and needed someone to drive him to practice. I learned early to make excuses for them. Marcus needed more support because he was struggling. I was naturally gifted and didn't need the same level of encouragement. They were just trying to build his confidence. I convinced myself these were reasonable explanations for why my achievements seemed to go unnoticed while Marcus's mediocre efforts received standing ovations. What made the dynamic even more painful was how obvious it was to everyone else. Teachers would ask me why my parents never came to academic award ceremonies. Friends' parents would comment on how self-sufficient I was, not realizing it wasn't a choice but a necessity. Extended family members would sometimes make uncomfortable jokes about who the favorite was, not understanding how deeply those words cut. By high school, the disparity had become even more pronounced. I maintained a 4.0 GPA, was captain of the debate team, played first violin in the youth symphony, and volunteered at a local shelter every weekend. Marcus barely maintained a C average, quit 3 different sports teams, and spent most of his time playing video games or hanging out with friends who were constantly in trouble. Yet when college application time came, our parents hired an expensive, private counselor for Marcus to help him get into a good school, while I was expected to handle the process myself because I was so capable. When Marcus got into a mediocre state university with a substantial financial aid package needed, because of his poor grades, they celebrated as if he'd been accepted to Harvard. When I received a full academic scholarship to Northwestern University, they nodded approvingly and said they always knew I'd figure it out. The summer before I left for college, our extended family gathered for a large barbecue at our house. My Aunt Sophia, Mom's sister, who had never been afraid to speak her mind, pulled me aside as I was serving drinks to everyone. "Mija," she said quietly, "I've been watching this family for years, and I need to tell you something. The way your parents treat you compared to Marcus, it's not right. You are an incredible young woman with so much to offer the world. Don't let them make you believe you're less worthy of love and attention." Her words hit me like a physical blow, because she was saying out loud what I'd felt but never dared to acknowledge. I started to defend my parents, to explain why Marcus needed more support, but she gently cut me off. "Elena, love should never be something you have to earn. You should be celebrated for who you are, not just for what you achieve. Promise me you won't lose yourself trying to win approval that should be freely given." That conversation stayed with me throughout college, even as I excelled academically, made lifelong friendships, and began to discover my own identity separate From my family's dysfunction, Aunt Sophia's words echoed in my mind. She had seen what I had been too afraid to see, that I was living my life trying to earn love that should have been my birthright. After graduation, I moved to New York City and started working at a prestigious marketing firm. I threw myself into my career with the same perfectionist drive that had characterized my academic years. I was promoted twice in 3 years, earned industry recognition for innovative campaigns, and was selected for a competitive leadership development program. Meanwhile, Marcus bounced between jobs, moved back home after college, and seemed content to drift through his 20s without any clear direction. My parents supported him financially and emotionally, treating his lack of ambition as if it were a temporary phase rather than a pattern that had persisted for years. When Marcus finally got engaged to his college girlfriend Sarah at age 26, you would have thought he had won a Nobel Prize based on my parents' reaction. They immediately began planning what they called the wedding of a lifetime, determined to give their son the celebration he deserved. I was happy for Marcus, truly. Sarah was a sweet girl who seemed to genuinely love him, and I hoped marriage might motivate him to finally take responsibility for his life. What I didn't anticipate was how the wedding planning would bring all our family's dysfunction into sharp relief. The budget my parents set was staggering, $50,000 for a single day's celebration. They rented an exclusive country club, hired the most expensive catering company in the city, and flew in flowers from across the country. No expense was too great for their precious son's special day. I watched this extravaganza being planned while living in a tiny studio apartment in Brooklyn, eating ramen noodles for dinner most nights because every penny of my salary went to rent and student loans. Not once did my parents offer to help me financially, even when I mentioned struggling to make ends meet in one of the most expensive cities in the world. "You're so independent, Elena," Mom would say with pride. "You don't need our help like Marcus does. You've always been able to take care of yourself." 8 months before Marcus's wedding, I noticed a small lump in my neck. At first, I dismissed it as a swollen lymph node from a cold I'd been fighting. But when it didn't go away after several weeks, I made an appointment with my doctor. The series of tests that followed were a blur of medical appointments, biopsies, and consultations with specialists. I took time off work for these appointments, using my limited sick days and often lying to my boss about why I needed to leave early or come in late. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I was in the middle of a client presentation when my phone rang and I saw my oncologist's name on the screen. I excused myself and stepped into an empty conference room. "Elena, I'm calling with your test results. I'm sorry to tell you that the biopsy confirmed Hodgkin's lymphoma. It's a very treatable form of cancer, especially when caught early as yours has been, but you'll need to begin treatment immediately." The words seemed to echo in the empty room. Cancer. I was 27 years old, had no family history of the disease, and had always been healthy. How was this possible? Dr. Peterson went on to explain the treatment plan: 6 months of chemotherapy, followed by radiation therapy if needed. The survival rate was excellent, he assured me, but the treatment would be intensive and expensive. After hanging up, I sat in that conference room for 20 minutes, staring at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. My first thought wasn't about mortality or fear, though those would come later. My first thought was about how I would handle this alone, because some deep part of me already knew that even cancer wouldn't make me a priority in my family. That evening, I called my parents to tell them the news. Mom answered, and I could hear the television in the background and Marcus's voice discussing flower arrangements for the wedding. "Mom, I need to tell you something important," I began, my voice shaking despite my efforts to stay calm. "Can it wait, sweetie? We're in the middle of choosing between roses and peonies for the centerpieces, and Marcus is getting overwhelmed with all the decisions." "Mom, I have cancer." The words hung in the silence that followed. Finally, she spoke, her voice shocked, but somehow still distracted. "Oh my God, Elena, are you sure? What kind? How serious is it?" I explained what Dr. Peterson had told me about the treatment plan and the prognosis. As I spoke, I could hear her relaying the information to Dad and Marcus in hushed tones. "Well, thank goodness it's treatable," she said finally. "You're so strong, honey. I know you'll beat this. Do you need anything? The question caught me off guard because it sounded like genuine care, something I'd been craving from her my entire life. But before I could answer, I heard Marcus in the background. Mom, we really need to decide on these flowers tonight. The florist needs confirmation by tomorrow morning. Elena, I need to go. We'll talk more about this later, okay? Take care of yourself. And just like that, the conversation ended. My cancer diagnosis had been acknowledged, filed away, and overshadowed by the urgent matter of wedding flowers. The following months were the most difficult of my life, and I faced them almost entirely alone. Chemotherapy turned out to be every bit as brutal as I'd heard. The fatigue was crushing, not just tiredness, but a bone-deep exhaustion that made simple tasks like showering feel insurmountable. The nausea was constant, making it nearly impossible to eat. My hair fell out in clumps, leaving me bald and feeling stripped of femininity and identity. I had to take a leave of absence from work, which meant living on short-term disability payments that covered only a fraction of my usual salary. Between medical bills, prescription costs, and basic living expenses, I was drowning financially. My parents called occasionally to check on my progress, but these conversations were brief and somehow always seemed to circle back to wedding planning. Updates. When I mentioned struggling with the cost of medications, Mom would make sympathetic noises, but then quickly change the subject to whether they should upgrade the bar package at the reception. The physical isolation was matched by emotional abandonment. Friends from work tried to stay in touch, but the reality of serious illness is that it makes many people uncomfortable. Visits became less frequent, calls more sporadic. I understood. We were all young, just starting our careers and adult lives. Cancer felt foreign and frightening to people who still believed they were invincible. But the absence of my family during this time was devastating in a way I hadn't anticipated. This wasn't about friends who couldn't relate to my experience. This was about the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, choosing to treat my life-threatening illness as an inconvenience that interfered with party planning. 3 months into treatment, I received a call from Mom that I initially thought might signal a change in their priorities. Elena, I've been thinking about you so much lately, she began, and for a moment my heart lifted with hope. I know this has been difficult for you, and I want you to know how proud I am of how you're handling everything. Thanks, Mom. It means a lot to hear you say that. Of course, honey. Now, I need to ask you something about the wedding. Marcus and Sarah really want you to be in the wedding party, maybe as a bridesmaid or to do a reading during the ceremony. Do you think you'll be feeling well enough by September? The question hit me like a physical blow. After months of minimal contact and support, she was calling not to offer help or express genuine concern, but to determine whether my cancer treatment would interfere with wedding photos. I don't know, Mom. It depends on how the treatment goes and whether I need radiation afterward. Well, we need to let Sarah know soon so she can plan accordingly. Maybe you could ask your doctor for a timeline? Ask my oncologist for a timeline, based on wedding planning needs. The absurdity of the request was almost funny, except for how much it hurt. I'll let you know when I have more information, I said, ending the call quickly before the tears that were threatening could be heard in my voice. That night, I sat in my tiny apartment feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. I was fighting cancer without family support, struggling financially, and apparently my primary value to my parents was whether I'd be healthy enough to participate in Marcus's special day. The 4th month of treatment brought complications. My white blood cell count dropped dangerously low, requiring hospitalization for a week to prevent infection. I called my parents from the hospital bed to let them know where I was. "Oh no, honey, that sounds scary," Mom said when I explained about the blood count issue. "How long do they think you'll be there?" "Probably a week, maybe more, depending on how I respond to the treatment." "A week? Oh dear. Marcus's bachelor party is this weekend. Your father is supposed to give a toast, and I'm hosting the bridal shower on Sunday. We really can't miss those events." I stared at the ceiling of the hospital room, IV pole beside my bed, and tried to process what she'd just said. I was hospitalized with a potentially life-threatening complication, and her concern was about missing a bachelor party and bridal shower. "I understand," I said quietly, which was the response I'd been trained to give my entire life when my needs conflicted with Marcus's wants. "You're so understanding, Elena. This is why you're such a special daughter. We'll visit as soon as we can after the weekend activities." They never came. By the time the wedding festivities ended, my blood count had stabilized and I'd been discharged. Mom called to check on me and seemed relieved to hear I was home. "See? We knew you'd be fine. You're so resilient." As my treatment continued into the summer, the wedding preparations reached a fever pitch. Every conversation with my family included detailed updates about dress fittings, menu tastings, and vendor meetings. The contrast between their excitement about the wedding and their detached concern about my health became increasingly stark. 2 weeks before the wedding, I received my final chemotherapy treatment. Dr. Peterson was optimistic about my progress and said I wouldn't need radiation therapy. I was officially in remission, though I would need regular monitoring for the next several years. When I called to share this incredible news with my parents, Mom was genuinely thrilled. "Oh, Elena, that's wonderful news. What perfect timing, too. Oh, you'll be feeling so much better for Marcus's wedding. This is such a relief for all of us. Perfect timing." As if my 6-month battle with cancer had been scheduled around my brother's wedding, rather than being a life-threatening illness I'd faced largely alone. The week of the wedding, I traveled back to Chicago. I had lost 30 pounds during treatment. My hair was just beginning to grow back in short, uneven patches, and I tired easily. But I was alive, in remission, and determined to celebrate with my family despite everything. The rehearsal dinner was held at an upscale restaurant downtown. As I sat at the family table, listening to toast after toast about Marcus and Sarah's love story, I reflected on the past 6 months. Here was my family, gathered together to celebrate love and commitment, while I had spent half a year fighting for my life with minimal support from any of them. During a lull in the toasts, Aunt Sophia appeared at my side. She had aged in the years since I'd seen her, but her eyes were as sharp and kind as ever. "Misha," she whispered, pulling me into a gentle hug. "Look at you. You made it through." I hadn't told extended family about my diagnosis, wanting to avoid the inevitable questions and sympathy that felt too complicated to navigate while I was in treatment. But somehow Aunt Sophia seemed to understand that I had been through something significant. "How do you know?" I asked. She touched my short hair gently. "A woman doesn't cut her beautiful long hair unless something major has happened. Plus, you're thin, pale, and you have that look in your eyes, like you've seen things you shouldn't have had to see alone." Her perceptiveness brought tears to my eyes. In 30 seconds, this woman who saw me maybe once a year had noticed things my parents had ignored for months. "Cancer?" I whispered. "Hodgkin's lymphoma. I finished treatment 2 weeks ago." Her face went through a series of emotions: shock, sorrow, anger, and finally fierce protectiveness. "And where were Roberto and Catherine during all this?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. I glanced across the table where my parents were laughing at something Marcus had said, completely absorbed in his pre-wedding excitement. "They were busy," I said, using the same excuse I'd made for them my entire life. Aunt Sophia followed my gaze and her expression hardened. "Busy," she repeated, while their daughter fought cancer. "It's complicated, Tia. The wedding planning has been intense, and I'm independent. I didn't want to burden them." "Elena Maria Martinez," she said, using my full name the way she had when I was a child, and needed to hear an important truth. "Cancer is not a burden you carry alone to protect other people's feelings. It's a crisis where family shows up, period." Before I could respond, Marcus stood up to give an impromptu toast, thanking everyone for their support during the wedding planning process. "Sarah and I feel so blessed to have family who have gone above and beyond to make our dream wedding come." "True," he began. "Mom and Dad, you've been incredible, spending countless hours and resources to give us this perfect celebration. We know it hasn't been easy, and we appreciate every sacrifice you've made." Sacrifice. I almost laughed at the word. The only sacrifice I'd witnessed was their sacrifice of my needs for his wants, a pattern that had characterized our entire lives and reached its peak during my cancer treatment. After the rehearsal dinner, I returned to my hotel room and sat on the bed, staring at my reflection in the mirror across from me. The woman looking back had survived cancer, but she looked hollow, worn down not just by chemotherapy, but by a lifetime of emotional neglect that had reached its nadir during her greatest crisis. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I would give a speech at tomorrow's reception. Not the generic bridesmaid speech I had originally planned, but something that finally told the truth about our family dynamic and my experience over the past 6 months. I spent that night writing and rewriting, trying to find words that were honest but not cruel, that expressed my pain without ruining Marcus's day entirely. I wasn't trying to destroy the wedding, but I needed to finally say what had been unsaid for far too long. The wedding ceremony itself was beautiful. Marcus looked handsome in his tuxedo. Sarah was radiant in her designer gown, and my parents glowed with pride as they watched their son marry the woman of his dreams. During the ceremony, I tried to focus on the joy of the moment and push aside the hurt that had been building for months. The reception was everything my parents had envisioned: elegant, expensive, and perfectly orchestrated. The country club ballroom was transformed into a fairy tale setting with the flowers they had spent hours selecting, the upgraded bar service, and the gourmet dinner that had required multiple tastings to perfect. During cocktail hour, I mingled with relatives and family friends I hadn't seen in years. Several commented on how thin I looked, asking if I'd been sick. I deflected these questions, not wanting to overshadow the celebration with talk of cancer. But as the evening progressed and I watched my parents bask in the compliments about the beautiful wedding they had thrown for their son, something inside me began to crack. Every praise they received for their generosity and love felt like salt in a wound that had been festering for 6 months. When it came time for speeches, Dad went first, giving an emotional tribute to Marcus about how proud he was of the man his son had become. Mom followed with a tearful speech about Sarah joining their family and how excited she was to welcome a daughter-in-law who would be loved and cherished. The best man and maid of honor gave their speeches, full of funny anecdotes and heartfelt wishes for the couple's future. Then the DJ announced that Marcus's sister would like to say a few words. I walked to the microphone on shaking legs, looking out at the sea of faces, family, friends, and acquaintances all expecting a typical wedding speech about love and happiness. At the head table, my parents smiled encouragingly, probably relieved that I looked healthy enough to participate in their perfect day. Good evening, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Elena, Marcus's sister. I paused, took a deep breath, and looked directly at my parents. When people ask me about my relationship with my family, I usually tell them how proud I am of my successful parents and my charming brother. How blessed I feel to be part of such an accomplished, beautiful family. Smiles and nods from the audience. This was exactly what they expected to hear. But tonight, surrounded by all this love and celebration, I want to share a different story. A story about what it's like to be the invisible child in a family where love is conditional and attention must be earned. The atmosphere in the room shifted. I could see confused expressions, my parents' smiles faltering. 6 months ago, I was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, cancer. I spent the past half year undergoing chemotherapy, losing my hair, fighting for my life. Gasps from the audience. Family members who hadn't known looked shocked. I could see Aunt Sophia nodding grimly from her table. During those 6 months, while I was in treatment, hospitalized, and facing the possibility of dying at 27, my parents were here, planning this beautiful celebration. And I understand. Weddings are important, joyous occasions that require attention and resources. I looked at Marcus, whose face had gone pale. Sarah was clutching his hand, both of them staring at me with growing horror. But what I can't understand is how parents can spend $50,000 on one perfect day for their son, while their daughter fights cancer alone because she's independent and doesn't need support the way he does. The room was dead silent now. I could see Mom shaking her head slightly, as if willing me to stop talking. When I was hospitalized with complications that could have killed me, they missed visiting because it was the weekend of the bachelor party and bridal shower. When I called crying because I couldn't afford my medications, they were upgrading the bar package for tonight's reception. Dad stood up abruptly, his face red with anger and embarrassment. Elena, this is not the time or place for this. When is the time, Dad? When would be appropriate for me to mention that I nearly died while you were choosing between roses and peonies? Should I have made an appointment to discuss my cancer diagnosis so it wouldn't interfere with wedding planning? My voice was steady, but tears were streaming down my face now. I could see Marcus starting to stand, probably to escort me away from the microphone, but I pressed on. I want to be clear, I'm not trying to ruin this celebration. Marcus and Sarah, you deserve happiness, and I'm genuinely glad you found each other. This beautiful wedding, this outpouring of love and support, you should have this. I turned back to face my parents. But I deserved support too. I deserved parents who would sit beside my hospital bed instead of at vendor meetings. I deserved a family who would rally around me during the scariest time of my life instead of treating my illness as an inconvenience that might interfere with photo opportunities. The silence was deafening. 300 people sat frozen, unsure whether to look at me, at my parents, or at their plates. I'm in remission now, and I'm grateful to be alive to see my brother get married. But I need you all to understand something. Surviving cancer taught me that life is too short to spend it begging for love from people who have shown repeatedly that they don't have it to give. I set the microphone back in its stand and looked one last time at my parents, who were staring at me with expressions of shock, anger, and what might have been the first glimpse of shame I'd ever seen on their faces. Congratulations, Marcus and Sarah. I wish you both the love and support that everyone deserves. I walked out of the ballroom, through the lobby, and into the parking lot where I called an Uber to take me back to the hotel. Behind me, I could hear the sound of 300 people beginning to whisper, the perfect wedding celebration dissolving into chaos and uncomfortable conversations. Back in my hotel room, I sat on the bed and waited. I knew they would come. My parents, probably Marcus too, demanding explanations, apologies, anything to undo what had just happened. The knock came 20 minutes later. I opened the door to find all three of them standing in the hallway. Mom, Dad, and Marcus, still in their wedding attire but looking disheveled and upset. How could you do that? Marcus asked immediately, his voice broken. How could you destroy my wedding like that? I didn't destroy anything, I said calmly, stepping aside to let them enter. I told the truth. You humiliated us in front of our entire family and all our friends, Mom said, her voice shaking with anger. Do you have any idea what you've done? Yes, I replied. I finally said what needed to be said after 28 years of silence. Dad, who had been quiet, finally spoke. Elena, we know the past few months have been difficult for you, but that doesn't give you the right to... Difficult, I interrupted. Dad, I had cancer. I could have died. And the most support I got from my family was occasional check-in phone calls and concerns about whether I'd be healthy enough for wedding photos. That's not fair, Mom protested. We were concerned about you, but you're so independent you never asked for help. I shouldn't have to ask my parents to care that I'm fighting a life-threatening illness. Marcus sat down heavily in the room's single chair, his head in his hands. Why did you have to do it today? On my wedding day? Couldn't you have talked to us privately later? I looked at my brother, this man who had been given everything his entire life without having to ask, and tried to find compassion for his perspective. When would have been a good time, Marcus? During the months I was in chemotherapy while you were choosing flowers? During my hospitalization while you were having your bachelor party? There's never been a time when my needs didn't take a back seat to your wants. We didn't know it was that serious, Mom said weakly. You didn't want to know, I corrected. Knowing would have required you to acknowledge that your perfect family narrative wasn't true. We talked for another hour, going in circles. They were hurt and angry about the public humiliation. I was hurt and angry about months of abandonment during my health crisis. No one's mind was changed, but perhaps for the first time, the truth about our family dynamic was finally out in the open. When they left, Marcus lingered at the door. Elena, I'm sorry about the cancer stuff. I really didn't understand how bad it was. I know, I said softly. But that's part of the problem. You've never had to understand because everything has always been about you. He nodded slowly, perhaps beginning to glimpse the reality I'd been living with our entire lives. After they left, I sat in that hotel room and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Relief. The truth was out. The perfect family facade had crumbled. The cost had been high, but the weight of pretense and silence was finally lifted from my shoulders. The next morning, I flew back to New York. The wedding aftermath played out over the following weeks through a series of phone calls and family drama I heard about secondhand through Aunt Sophia, who had become my only reliable source of family news. Apparently, the reception had continued after I left, but the atmosphere was strained. Several relatives approached my parents with questions and concerns about how they had handled my illness. Extended family members who had witnessed years of the favoritism dynamic felt validated in their suspicions. Others were simply shocked to learn about my cancer diagnosis and wondered how they could have been so unaware. Aunt Sophia called me the day after the wedding. "Mija, I am so proud of you for finally speaking your truth," she said. "It wasn't easy to watch, but it was necessary." "Did I ruin Marcus's wedding?" I asked, still grappling with guilt about the timing. "No, honey, you revealed the truth about your family. Marcus's wedding was beautiful, and he and Sarah are married and happy. But maybe now your parents will have to confront the reality of how they've treated you." 2 weeks after the wedding, I received a long email from my father. Unlike his usual brief communications, this message showed evidence of genuine reflection. "Elena, I've spent the past 2 weeks thinking about what you said at the wedding, and I need to acknowledge some uncomfortable truths. Your mother and I have failed you in ways we're only beginning to understand. When you were diagnosed with cancer, we were so caught up in wedding planning that we didn't grasp the severity of what you were facing. But that's not really an excuse, is it? We should have dropped everything to support you, just as we would have for Marcus. You're right that we've treated you differently throughout your lives. We told ourselves it was because you were more capable, more independent. But we can see now that we used your strength as an excuse to give you less attention and support, not more. I don't know if we can repair the damage that's been done, but I want you to know that we're committed to trying. We love you, Elena, even though we've done a poor job of showing it. Can we talk? Dad." His email was more acknowledgement than I'd received in my entire lifetime, but I wasn't ready to respond immediately. Months of fighting cancer alone had given me clarity about what I needed and deserved from relationships. 3 months later, I finally called them. The conversation was difficult, but more honest than any we'd ever had. My parents were beginning therapy to understand their own patterns and how they'd affected both their children. Marcus was also starting to grasp how his privileged position in the family had shaped his relationship with me. The healing process has been slow and sometimes painful. My parents will never be the supportive, nurturing figures I needed during childhood and young adulthood. But they're trying to understand the damage that was done and working to build a healthier relationship going forward. I've learned that speaking truth, even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable, is sometimes the only way to break destructive patterns. My cancer diagnosis was devastating, but it also gave me a clarity about what truly matters in life and relationships. 6 months after that wedding reception speech, I'm still in remission, thriving in my career, and building relationships based on mutual respect rather than desperate attempts to earn approval. The family I was born into may never fully understand my worth, but I've finally learned to value myself regardless of their recognition. If you're watching this and recognize yourself in my story, if you're the child who has spent your life trying to earn love that should be freely given, please know that your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to see it. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do for ourselves is to speak our truth, even when it's uncomfortable for everyone else to hear. My parents spent $50,000 on my brother's wedding, but couldn't spare time to support me through cancer. That disparity revealed everything I needed to know about their priorities. But more importantly, my decision to finally speak that truth revealed everything I needed to know about my own strength and worth. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need to hear that they deserve better. Hit that like button if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, and subscribe for more stories about finding your voice and claiming your worth. Remember, you don't need permission to value yourself, you don't need approval to speak your truth, and you definitely don't need to earn love that should be your birthright. The speech I gave at that wedding reception changed everything. Not because it magically transformed my family, but because it finally freed me to transform myself. And sometimes that's exactly what needs to happen.